Mr. Burke, state water contractor, DWR for 60, land for 10, and C-SPA for 10. Are there any other requests? All right, with that, then I expect we at least will complete this portion today. We still have a pending request from Ms. Morris. Is that request still valid? Seeing a nod from Ms. Morris, we will either during a morning break or a lunch break today discuss that. Ms. Desjardins.
Yes, given that there is another phase of this rebuttal part of the hearing.
There is a request, and I've also noted your request as well, made at the same time that Ms. Morris made her request regarding your subpoena of a DWR witness.
There was one more, just that the draft supplemental EIR's rule beyond the scope of rebuttal, based on that there wasn't testimony on it in part in the rebuttal phase of the hearing, and for the most part that was true, but there was one appendix, and that there was
this
the
was the floating
so
issue.
I wanted to remove my request to allow some rebuttal on that, since it was real beyond the scope of rebuttal.
And on what new grounds do you make that request for reconsideration?
Just that their rebuttal to that testimony should be allowed in some part of the hearing.
Because the rationale, the new rationale that you're providing, because we did rule on it previously.
It's part of due process under the state and federal constitution that parties have a right to examine and rebut evidence. It's been settled law for 100 years. I can provide a case citation if needed.
And that rationale, I think, was provided before, but thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other outstanding motion that I have forgotten to mention? Motions, requests, objections?
Good morning. Anything, right? It's not really a motion. I guess I'm just wanted to add on a little bit to what Ms. Desjardins said in a slightly different note, is that we still do have the environmental review prepared by the Bureau and DWR, which is out, and that I think the board's rulings have indicated would eventually need to come within the record, and I think also indicated that if and when that happens, that we would revisit whether additional testimony was necessary.
That all is true.
Since we're getting toward what may be the end of part 2 rebuttal, I guess I just want to make a place saver that I definitely do have and will have arguments about that with respect to how that relates to the evidentiary.
I expect others will as well, and we have stated in writing, as a matter of fact, that when that final document is submitted to us, we will then ask for input from the parties and consider what additional steps are necessary.
Yeah, because I mean, just to clarify, the reason why I'm bringing it up is there's kind of two tracks going on here. One, the Water Board is a responsible agency which can just receive documents, and that's part of its responsible agency record. With respect to the evidentiary proceedings and the water rights, it's a little different, and so I just want to
I understand.
Sure. Thank you.
Ms. Meserve. I have a note that the webcast may be down, so all the lucky people who are watching do not get to see this. All right. Mr. Mizell.
Yeah, Trip Mizell, DWR. At this time, the department would withdraw the request for further witnesses based upon the trust issue that we discussed on Friday.
I'm sorry. So you are withdrawing your request. Does the state water contractor's request still stand? All right. All right. Mr. Emmerich, I guess we are now finally to you.
Yes, for this morning, I think because it's going to be a little bit more technical questions, Ms. Desjardins is going to help, or is going to assist Ms. Womack. I'll be here to provide assistance with respect to clarification or objections.
All right. I think Mr. Hunt, who is assisting us today, was quite generous in setting the timer last night, I believe there was a request for, I think it was 30 minutes from you, Mr. Emmerich, and then 5 questions from Ms. Womack. Has that changed overnight?
Well,
I mean,
no,
over the weekend?
Well, mine are kind of rounds of, there's a few things that lead up to the questions. So there actually might be 4 questions, but there are few parts to get to them. So, and it depends on the cross. So mine would probably be no more than a half hour.
And Mr. Emmerich,
Yeah, I think probably no more than 45 minutes.
in total. All right, let's reset the clock to 45 minutes. And looks like the webcast is working again. So welcome to all of those who are watching. I'm sorry you don't get the morning off. All right. With that, we will turn to either Ms. Womack or Ms. Desjardins.
I'll go ahead and start out. Let's see. No, I need to start here. Right. So could I have, well, first question is for Mr. Bernardsky, and in your testimony on page 6 at line 15, it states that DWR may assist with securing permits. Do we need to get that on the screen for alternative water supplies? Is that something you?
That's correct.
That's correct. Thank you.
That's consistent with my
Okay.
previous
And
testimony.
So,
in Part
Mr.
1.
Hunt, could we get up CCLP 70, please? Oh. Oops, technical difficulties. Sorry about that. This is I guess, a worms map. These things I can't imagine that shows 2 of CCLP diversions, licensed diversions. One is right next to the intake of the Clifton Court forebay, and then there are right there you can see where the one set of control gates are, and the other is down here in the Delta Mendota intake that you propose to change the name to the Jones Channel. So those 2 are there. Are you aware that a change petition would be needed to change either of our points of diversion?
I'm assuming there would be. I believe we spoke about that in Part 1 in my original testimony. We talked about potentially having to move diversions near the intake, so I think it would be the same process.
A change petition, okay. And that would be, you say DWR may assist with that.
I believe we've written the wording flexible, so DWR could take the lead if necessary. You know, we're flexible on our role on that.
Okay, okay. All right, well, let's move on. So let's see, this kind of goes between Mr. Chilmacurry, Dr. Chilmacurry, and Dr. or Mr. Doctor? Yeah, sorry about that. And Mr. Bernardsky. I will refer to this map again because I think it really does a nice job of showing where Clifton Court where our property is, where 2 of our diversion points are, where Old River is, and Western Canal, all the canals that are kind of affected. So let's see, Mr. Chilmacurry, on DWR 1304, Mr. Hunt 5-6 on PDF 62 of the conceptual engineering report. I will. So DWR, if we could put up DWR 1304, chapter 5-6, it's PDF 62, and on section, let's see, once we'll get there. Okay, if we scroll down to 5.1.6.3, that's perfect. Does it not state that the control gates will control flow out of the Byron Tract forebay, the Clifton Court forebay, and the Old River to meet target deliveries at Jones and Banks? And let's see. Is it
At Jones and Banks Pumping Plant.
pumping plants? I'm sorry.
So that would be the first sentence of the third paragraph, Ms. Womack?
I believe so.
I'm sorry, the second sentence.
Second. Yeah, it's kind of stated a few different ways in here.
Mr. Bednarski. Yeah.
Yes, that's what the text says.
Oh,
A-
okay.
And so the goal here is to control it to meet target deliveries, is that correct?
To control what?
It says to the.
Control the flow out of.
Control flow out of Byron Tract 4-Bay, Clifton Court 4-Bay, and Old River. The goal in controlling those flows is to meet target deliveries?
That's correct.
Okay.
Target pumping deliveries,
Target-
exports.
Target
yes.
export deliveries?
Yes.
These are for export. Okay. Does it not state that the flow control system will be such that it maximizes the diversion opportunities from the north and south delta intakes? I believe
That's what it says.
That's what
Yes.
it says, yes.
Okay. And, okay, so let's go to the design water surface elevations on page 63. I believe it's the next page of the CER. Oh, and if we could start at the top. The design, doesn't it say at the top that the state, at top of these are only recommended these flows at the very top,
Elevations.
water level elevations? Mr. Bernardsky.
Yes, that's what it states.
Okay, and at the bottom, in the footnote, doesn't it say, Mr. Bernardsky, that the WC for a potential dual source operational scenario will be refined during a later design phase? And that would be, perhaps we could go up a little, or you can see that.
I can see that. Yes, that's what it says.
Okay.
So, Mr. Bednarski, the design water surface elevations have not yet been determined. Would that be correct?
The final water surface elevations have not been determined. That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, if everyone could please move the microphone closer. The
Closer.
court reporter is having a hard
Sure.
time hearing you.
Sorry.
Mr. Bednarski, in forming your opinion about whether the dual operation of the control gates would affect Clifton Court's Burbays, did you take into account the specifications of CCLP's pump?
We don't have any information on their pump. No, we did not.
Okay.
Are you aware that CCLP has wanted to replace that pump with a post-night?
Okay,
Okay.
that's all right.
Yep.
Okay, let's move on to throttling at Jones Control Structure.
So that question was withdrawn because
yes,
I
yes.
think there was an objection pending about facts, not in evidence. So you've withdrawn it, and now you're moving on.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I want to move on to throttling and throttling at I guess it's all the control structures. Sorry, Mr. Hunt, we need to move. Oh, it's page 62. Go back to section 5.1.6.3 on page 62. And so, Mr. Bernardsky, doesn't it state that the control structures will need to be capable of throttling flow from all three sources, the Byron Tract 4-Bay, the Clifton Court 4-Bay, and Old River?
That's what the text says, yes.
What does throttling mean?
It typically means restricting the flow to break the hydraulic grade so that you can control the flow.
Would reducing and
grading.
restricting be the same thing?
I'm sorry, I don't follow the question.
Is the flow going to be reduced?
I believe I explained last week that we most probably in this channel will have the gates open to minimize the restriction at this point, and we will be using the gate in the interconnecting channel to throttle the flow coming from the north delta diversions to match the water surface elevation that's in the Jones intake channel. That with our conceptual design is the scheme that we're planning to use now.
When when will the control structure be closed on the Jones, or, well, the DMC intake where my diversion is? When will that be closed?
Right. Under the scheme that we have now, the times that it will be closed, as I explained Friday, would be when we are taking North Delta diversions and we are not diverting from the south. We would have that gate closed, fully closed.
Mr. Bednarski, does it not state that the open channel that feeds the Jones pumping plant downstream of the Tracy Fish Facility must maintain a lower water surface elevation from all three sources to maintain flow control?
Yes, but I think the way that sentence was meant to be implied or understood is that it would have a lower water surface elevation than at the control structure with the North Delta deliveries, because that's where we're going to do our main throttling. So we need to have the water surface in that, in the Delta Mendota or the Jones intake channel lower than in the interconnecting channel, so we can have a lower hydraulic gradient there and actually break head into that channel from the higher hydraulic gradient.
So what you're saying what you're saying then is that in Jones, it's going to be lower where my diversion is.
It will not change from where it is now. That's what I was explaining on Friday, that will continue to ride on the tidal influence as it does now when that gate is open. The water surface elevation as it comes out of the tunnels and before it flows through that control structure that allows the water to go into the Jones intake channel, that will be at a higher water surface elevation than in the Jones intake channel. So we'll break head there and allow that water to flow into that channel and then into the Jones pumping plant.
Mr. Bednarski, can you explain the discrepancy between your testimony just now and the conceptual engineering report, which states the open channels that feeds Banks and Jones pumping plant downstream of the Skinner Fish Facility and downstream of the Tracy Fish Facility must maintain a lower WSE from all three sources to maintain flow control of all the throttling gates at each source?
I really think we're kind of splitting hairs here, and that we have to recognize that we have a conceptual design that's been done, and I've been trying to do my best to explain how we wrote this some months ago and the way that I understand that the system would be designed and operated, and those final refinements will be made in preliminary design. And we've offered to share that information as we're designing that, and, to make sure that there are no impacts on Clifton Court LP's pumping facilities.
But how will the board be able to make a decision if they don't have proper information?
Well, I believe that, through my testimony, we've presented a sort of an overarching set of commitments to not have a negative impact on the CCLP diversions, and that would be the vehicle that we would use to accomplish that, either through the design of this facility or potentially moving the diversion. Those are all listed in my mitigation measures, and we would follow that path as we're going through the process.
But Mr. Bednarski, as of this point, there's no information about the specific design or the specific mitigation measure.
Mr. Mizell?
Misstates the record.
Sustain.
Mr. Bednarski, this is all a conceptual design, and you testified that it could change?
Asked and answered.
Okay. Have you done analysis to show how the blocked control gates that will reduce the channel WSE will raise Old River water levels? Have there been studies, impact studies?
I'm not sure I understand.
What? Let me clarify.
Please.
So in my mind, there's daily changes in pumping. It says every day it can change. So we have, say, we have them pumping with the gates open other than where the structure interferes, so it's not completely open. And they're pumping, and then they decide, oh, we've got a BTF coming in from the north. We're going to close the control structure. Well, water doesn't just stop. So it's going to keep flowing, and it's used to going in that direction. It kind of stops. So my water levels, I would imagine, are going to be rising when that control structure comes down. It just makes sense. So there's going to be kind of a back and forth, and I wonder if that has been modeled. In my mind, it makes sense to me.
All right, thank you. I understand the question now. Mr. Mizell?
Yes, I object to facts not in evidence. If she'd like to phrase this as a hypothetical,
We'll consider it a hypothetical. Please answer the question.
So, as Mr. Bernardsky explained to you on Friday, there needs to be additional hydraulic modeling that needs to be conducted, which he explained that for the entire system, starting at Jones Pumping Plant intake in the South Canal, all the way up to the North Delta diversions, there needs to be hydraulic modeling conducted to estimate the hydraulic grade lines and for designing the control gate structures. That has to be conducted. And what we've been saying is that when that modeling is conducted and when the design is going to be taken to the next level, the CCLP's pumping plant and their needs will be considered in designing those control gates and making sure that they would not be impacted because of these operations.
Yes, Mr. Hunt, could you put up CCLP 70 one more time? So this is for, I believe, Mr. Bernardsky or Mr. Chilmacurry. Has DWRC, or the California WaterFix, stepped foot on my levees or conducted studies of, stepped foot to conduct studies on my levee to see how they will be affected, they could be affected by raised water levels? We have a mile of levee, over a mile, that starts at the intake for the CCF, and it goes all the way down to the Tracy Fish facility. This is a huge amount of levee that only Clifton Court has to take care of because we don't have Reclamation 802 had to go out of business. We couldn't afford to run it.
Mr. Mizell?
yeah, I'm going to object again to facts not in evidence. The evidence that's in the record shows no rise in water elevations in the South Delta region. So I'm not sure where these facts are coming from, and we haven't had a chance to assess them.
One final question. So during times of flood, like in 2017, who decides if the control gates are closed or open?
Objection. Are you asking that question in general as a hypothetical in the event that there were high flows, or are you asking specifically about 2016?
2017. In the example of a flooding situation, who decides whether or not the BTF gets to take or the control gates down, who gets to take the water, the flood water?
We'll consider it a hypothetical if you are able to answer.
Yeah, that's beyond my knowledge as part of the engineering team as to who would make calls during flood conditions as to which gates in the Delta are open and which ones are closed.
Mr. Bernardsky, are you aware that the original mandate of the SWP and the CCF was to prevent flooding in the South Delta? That was why it was put in. That's in the very original documents.
Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence.
I will find it and bring it up. Thank you.
Mr. Chilmacurry, I did want to, since there was an objection about assuming facts not in evidence, I'd like to go to the modeling of water levels. So if we could go back, I'd like to pull up Exhibit SWRCB 102, Mr. Hunt. And Volume 1. And then I'd like to go to Appendix 5A, Additional Modeling, Section D, Attachment 6. Scroll down It's down further. That's it, yes. And I'd like to go to page 9, please. And then let's zoom in on the lower left corner where Clifton Court Forebay is. Let's zoom in more, please. Yeah, continue zooming. So, Mr. Chilmacurry, you testified about this modeling. And let's scroll over to the left. So the DMC intake, you testified yesterday that the DMC intake leading to the Tracy pumping plant was channels 214 and 216. Would that be correct?
Mr. Hunt, could you please move the mouse a little bit? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
All right. And Ms. Womack's diversion is in channel 214. Is that correct?
It would be, I don't know. Sitting here, I have to look into the details of the channel lengths or DSM2 inputs to determine the channel lengths, and I need to look at Ms. Womack's, where Ms. Womack's intake is located in reference to the Jones pumping plant or the junction with Old River to determine that.
It is node 70, but is node 70 the Tracy Fish facility?
Approximately. I mean, that is, node 70 is roughly the junction of Old River and Jones pumping plant intake channel.
So, Mr. Jones, you testified previously, Mr. Chilmacurry, you testified previously that there's no explicit representation of the gates of the control structure on Jones, the proposed control structure. I'm wondering, doesn't the DSM-2 model only consider exports from the Jones pumping plant at intervals of a day?
That's correct.
And doesn't it also only consider exports from the isolated facility at intervals of a day?
The time series inputs for those exports are daily, but the model is running on a 15-minute time step. So the model assumes that the export values will be the same throughout the day, but for every 15 minutes, it just assumes that the export would be equal to the daily average value. But the inputs to the model are daily average.
So you don't have any modeling of the effect of intermittent diversions from either the Tracy pumping plant or the North Delta intakes in the DSM-2 model.
DSM-2 model runs on a 15-minute time step. I don't know what you mean by intermittent operations. And in fact, in the North Delta diversion, the diversions are actually changing on a 15-minute basis. I'm just saying that the input boundary conditions are on a daily average basis, but that means the model is just assuming the amount of exports at North Delta diversion or from the South Delta channels will be, at any given 15-minute time step, would be equal to the daily average value.
Mr. Hunt, can we go back to Exhibit DWR 1304, please? And I'd like to go to page 66. Scroll back up, and where it says on the third paragraph from the top, Mr. Chilmacurry, doesn't it indicate that there could be intermittent diversions from the North Delta intakes?
Yes.
And doesn't it state there that that they could be specific to the tidal state?
Yes.
So DSM-2 doesn't model
No.
intermittent diversions, correct?
No, you're wrong. Actually, DSM-2 does take into consideration the tidal influence, and that's what I was describing. That in the model, the DSM, when we are simulating the North Delta diversion in DSM-2, in a given day, there are stretches of time when the diversion is shut off if the sweeping velocity requirement is not met, and there will be stretches of day there will be diversion on, and that's the intermittent operation that this sentence is describing, and the model reflects that.
Okay, thank you. I'd also like to ask, the DSM-2 model assumes priority 3 gate operations for Clifton Court Forebay. Isn't that correct?
For both no action and WaterFix, yes.
But priority 3 gate operations are not a regulatory requirement, are they?
I'm going to object to the question, lack of foundation that this has to do with the water rights at CCLP's diversion points, as Dr. Chilmokuri just answered. The assumptions on priority 3 are the same with or without the project, and without a further showing that this has an influence on CCLPs, I think it's out of scope.
I would like just exploring the basis of his opinion about the tidal effects on water levels, and water levels have been modeled.
Overruled, Mr. Mizell.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, is it a regulatory requirement? Are priority 3 gate operations they are not a regulatory gate requirement, are they?
The water levels in the DMC intake channel, or the Jones pumping plant intake channel, that where Ms. Womack's intake is, the water levels there are not necessarily, well, actually, strike that.
Mr. Chilmokuri, may I
It's
interrupt
not
you
an.
for a
Hold on.
It's,
You need to speak one at a time for the court reporter. And Ms. Desjardins, please let Dr. Chilmokuri finish his response.
I would like him to answer the question.
Hold on.
Okay.
Dr. Chilmokuri, are you finished?
No, I'm not. I'm trying to answer the question.
Go ahead, then.
Yes, it's not, as far as I know, it's not a regulatory requirement. The priority 3 is not a regulatory requirement. However, it is an operational consideration that DWR makes on a daily basis to maintain the water levels in the South Delta channels, to be protective of those water levels. So it is a representation of how the Clifton Court radial gates would be operated to be protective of the South Delta water channels. And that operation does not change between the no action and WaterFix scenarios.
Mr. Chilmokuri, I'd like to bring up exhibit CCLP 75, please. Or Mr. Hunt. No, that, oops. I believe it's, I'm sorry. Is that CCLP 75? Okay, then I don't have the correct. I would like to scroll down. Can we go to page 2, please, of this exhibit?
Let's establish what this is and whether the
this
witnesses.
is a letter from
Hold on, please allow me to finish.
Yeah, okay.
And whether or not the witnesses are familiar with this document. Now you may respond.
Mr. Bednarski, there was a letter from local agencies of the North Delta and Central Delta Water Agency about the need to identify the impacted diversions. Are you aware of this letter?
No, I'm not.
I would like to ask about the action recommended on page 2. Can we go to page 2? There was a concern expressed that DWR and Reclamation had failed to identify the affected intakes, and that there was a truncated and vague discussion of injury to legal users of waters, and that the supplemental information section in the petition did not correct that deficiency. So you were not, that you were not aware of this concern that was raised?
I believe there's an objection forthcoming.
Yes, if we are referring to number 2, which refers to page 2, the recitation that Ms. Desjardins just finished is not contained within this paragraph. Subject to the form of the question, and it assumes facts not in evidence because her dissertation on the background of this question is not contained anywhere on this page.
So help me understand where you're going with this, Ms. Desjardins. Make the connection for me.
It's just that there was notice was Mr. Bednarski, who was the section manager and SDWR's witness, was this information about needing to identify, it says, the truncated and vague discussion of injury to legal users of water buried in the supplemental information section does not correct the deficiency in identifying
Ms.
legal sources
Desjardins.
of water and impacts.
Ms. Desjardins, that's what it says, but you need to put it in the context for me of this SIR rebuttal, which is an impact on CCLP's water rights. How does this relate, directly relate?
Were CCLP's water rights identified?
I believe that has been asked and answered.
Yeah, and was he aware of that there were early comments that this needed to be done for the petition?
That is too broad of a question. You need to limit it to the impact on CCLP's water rights. And if the question is whether or not they've considered it, that has been asked and answered numerous times.
Okay, let's move on. Thank you.
Mr. Emmerich, are you? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And please remind me now, Mr. Emmerich, what are your remaining lines of questioning?
These are going to focus on Dr. Chilmacurry. I have 3 or 4 questions they'll be doing with water quality in the South Delta as set forth in his testimony.
Thank you.
Come on.
If we could have DWR 1421 put on the screen. That's your testimony, is that correct, Dr. Chilmacurry?
Yes.
And if I could have you go to page 5, please. And if we go up a little bit more to show the, I'm sorry, the other way to show the graphs there. Dr. Chilmacurry, you've presented 2 figures here, figure CL2 and figure EC5. My question is, this is a comparison between the preferred operational modeling CWF H3 plus compared to the no action alternative. Is that correct?
The reason I included these graphs is just to note that this analysis.
I'm sorry, his question is more specific. Can you just answer that?
Yeah, it includes that, the CWF H3 plus and no action, but also includes the H3, H4, and BH3 plus scenarios.
Well, what I was going to ask you is, isn't it true that these graphs show that CWF H3 plus will have greater impacts on water quality, degrading impacts on water quality than the no action alternative in the South Delta?
Not necessarily, no. What these graphs are showing is that this salinity conditions would be similar to large extent, but there may be occasional cases, there would be increased salinity, as you can see in October, November, for example, in the top graph there. This is Old River at Clifton Court, the chloride concentrations. And that small increase, as I explained to you on Friday, and it was explained before, largely is a result of the head of Old River gate operation differences between the no action alternative and the WaterFix scenario.
So that's, if you can explain to me a little bit more, that's where you're testifying that the difference between CWF, H3+, and the no action alternative, that's the reason for it.
That's for South Delta channels, the changes in salinity, the primary reason is that. And also, of course, there is a change in the export operations between the no action alternative and the WaterFix scenarios at the South Delta intakes, and that's another driver.
Has DWR done any investigation, you yourself, or any investigation that you know of, that investigated the potential impacts on CCLP in the modeled increases in salinity, or EC, in the South Delta? For instance, has DWR looked at what the impacts to ability to grow crops or conduct farming would be under increased salinity levels in the South Delta?
As part of the EIS, I believe there was an extensive analysis on the agricultural impacts in the Delta. So I'd say yes.
And do you know what section that's in?
I don't recall the exact number.
And do you know whether that included CCLP?
Well, again, it's not specific. It was for the entire Delta, so they would be part of it.
Is there a reason why you didn't model boundary 1? Or excuse me, why you didn't look at boundary 1 for the analysis with respect to impacts to CCLP? Or at least why it's not shown in your testimony?
So then, again, the reason boundary 1 is not shown in these graphs is this is just, again, as I was trying to explain earlier, these are just examples of the information that was included in the testimony already, which presents information that's related to CCLP. Now, if you go back to part 1, Dr. Nader Terani's testimony, we have exact same graphs with boundary 1 included.
Do you know whether Dr. Terani, however, specifically looked at impacts to CCLP with respect to boundary 1? Again,
when you say specific, I mean all this information is providing reasonably what we can expect at CCLP with WaterFix. So I say I don't know how to answer. This is we are trying to infer using the information that we have available today. We are trying to infer or project what the potential impacts to CCLP would be. So I'd say yes, so the information is available to assess the effects to CCLP from WaterFix.
Okay, that's all I have. Did you have anything else you wanted to follow up with? I think that's all we have.
Thank you, Mr.
You
Emmer.
know what, can I look one more second, just to double
Ms.
check?
Womack wants to take one more
Just
look
one
at
more
her
check.
notes.
Thank
I
you
think we're
so
done.
much.
Thank you very much.
Any redirect, Mr. Mizell or Mr. Berliner?
No, we have no redirect.
Thank you. I believe staff has questions for this panel. Has a question, and then I believe Ms. McHugh, you had a clarification regarding the exhibits that you needed to follow up on.
Good morning. I believe this question's properly directed at Mr. Bednarski, but if Dr. Chilmacurry is able to answer as well, that would be helpful. At any point in developing any of the WaterFix proposals, have the petitioners evaluated the feasibility of moving the control structure downstream of Clifton Court's points of diversion?
We have looked at that as an option. We ran into some potential issues with some sensitive environmental concerns, habitats south of there. But our plan is to actually sort of ground truth that once we get into preliminary design, go out in the field and check to see if these sensitive habitats actually exist. They were in a library that's a pre-existing library that we used as a database to sort of categorize the different areas. And in that library, it showed up as a sensitive habitat. We would propose to go out during the preliminary design and actually determine whether it is or not. And if it isn't, then we would be open to moving that control structure south of where it is now.
Thank you. And was that evaluation documented somewhere in the WaterFix record, to your knowledge?
I'm not aware that it has. It would probably be in our working document somewhere.
Okay.
Mr. Derringer, could I know that's a question for him, but we have a very big concern either side. It's not a question of moving because...
Hold on, please.
Is that something?
No. This is
Okay.
not, we're not going
Okay.
to
But-
invite arguments at this
Oh,
time.
it's not an argument.
Thank
concerns on both sides, so there's more concerns either way.
That was all I had. Thank you. I think
Thank
Ms.
you.
McHugh has a question.
Yeah, I believe both Dr. Chilmacurry and Mr. Bednarski referred to the, in their testimony, referred to the administrative draft supplemental EIR or the public draft supplemental EIR, EIS. And then in Mr. Bednarski's testimony, you say the public draft supplemental EIR, EIS is submitted as Exhibit DWR 1416, but there's no 1416 on the exhibit identification index, and nothing was submitted, so I'm just
Yes,
wondering.
if Ms. McHugh, I can answer that. Trip Mizell. That is probably an editorial oversight on the part of myself when I was looking at the exhibit numbers and cross-referencing them for what we would be submitting. There was the notice by hearing staff about the use of a State Water Board exhibit number for the public draft SEIR, and that reference escaped my notice at the time. It should properly reference SWRCB
114.
114, yes.
But you didn't include it on your exhibit identification index, and we don't have it in our possession. We just marked it with, marked it for somebody to submit it. Gave it an exhibit number in case somebody submitted it.
Yes, if you would like, I will modify our exhibit index to reference the website where the public draft SEIR is available, much like as we did with the previous copies of the environmental document.
So do the references in these witnesses' testimony need to be corrected?
I believe Ms. McHugh has identified only one
Only one.
spot, so we can either correct that here on the record. The verbal or the written reference is to the public draft SEIR, and that is that has been given a State Board exhibit number at this time, and that's the only change there.
I think you do need to submit the files, though, and not a link to a website, so that we have them in our.
I'd be happy to coordinate with hearing staff offline if that's a better use of the hearing officer's time, or we can discuss it here. But we have submitted the previous copies of the environmental document in a few different ways, and we're happy to provide it in whatever format you'd like.
Okay.
Ms. Meserve?
Sorry, just a point of clarification. I guess I do object to the submittal of the public review draft into the record at this time. I understand that there's been a designation of what the exhibit number would be, but at this point it has not been submitted and no one has been allowed to submit testimony on it. And so I think my understanding is that the reference to that exhibit number in the testimony that we heard today should just be corrected to refer to the admin draft SCIR, because we don't have, none of the rest of us were able to refer to or use the public review draft in our testimony. So I'm not sure why DWR would be able to either.
Ms. Desjardins?
Yes, and it would be arbitrary to rule that the admin draft was beyond the scope of rebuttal for all of the protestants, and then to allow the petitioners to submit the entire public, or to rule that the public draft was beyond the scope of rebuttal for all the protestants, and then to allow the petitioners to submit the entire public draft. And I do not see any of this testimony that relies on or in any way uses information in the public draft. It's well beyond the scope of this part of the hearing, and to the extent there's new information in it, it should not be submitted at this time because of the scoping rulings.
Thank you. Mr. Mizell?
Yes, just to make this easy on the hearing officers and hearing staff, we will provide revised copies of both witnesses' testimonies that strike any reference to the public SEIR draft. We provided parallel citations. We thought it was more informative, but obviously it's causing more headache than it's worth. So we will provide written
Thank you.
Revisions.
And at this time, do you wish to move your exhibits into the record? Not including the public draft.
Yes, if you'd give me 1 second here. So the department would like to move DWR 1415, 1417, 1418, 1419, 1420, 1421, 1425, and 1426 into the record.
Thank you. Any objections?
I just have a question. Is 1425 and 1426 cross-examination exhibits, and are we waiting?
There is no 1426. 1425 is Stockton's response to ruling to produce information.
No, that's 1415. I thought
sorry.
he included 1425 and 1426 at the end of his list.
Oh,
I did include 1425 and 1426.
And were those cross-examination exhibits?
Yes.
Okay. So are we waiting, or is this the time?
yes, that's right. Let's go ahead and wait on cross-examination exhibits, please.
Very well. I'll resubmit 1425 and 1426 at a later time.
All right. With that, then 1415, 1417, 1418, 1419, 1420, and 1421 are received into the record.
I have one further point. So the website does not reflect that SWRCB 113 has been admitted into evidence. I don't want to make duplicative motions, but if it has not, then the department would submit SWRCB 113 also into evidence at this time.
113 is the administrative draft supplemental EIR-EIS.
That's correct.
Correct. All right. Hearing no objections, so received into the record. Thank you, Dr. Chilmacurry, Mr. Bernardsky. Before we take our morning break, let me confirm to see what else is on our to-do list. DWR and the state water contractors have withdrawn your request to produce additional witnesses. And with that, then we are also, with respect to Ms. Desjardins' 2 requests, they are denied. One was regarding the subpoena of a DWR witness. The other was with respect to the scope of rebuttal. And with that, we will take a break until 10:45. Upon then, we will hear from Mr. Burke. right, it is 10:45. Please take your seats, and we welcome back Mr. Burke. Mr. Reese, before we get to Mr. Burke's testimony, are there any objections that need to be stated for the record at this time? Ms. Desjardins.
Not an objection, but I would like to reserve up to 15 minutes for cross-examination of Mr. Burke.
All right, Mr. Reese, please begin.
Good morning, hearing officers. Dean Reese for the South Delta Water Agency parties. Mr. Burke is present with us this morning. Mr. Burke, is STWA 328 a true and correct copy of your rebuttal testimony for Part 2 of this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Can you please summarize your testimony at this point?
The testimony that I submitted as the rebuttal are in response to Dr. Chimmel Curry's rebuttal testimony and his opinion number 7, where he takes issue with some of the elements of our salt budget that we put together for the project. I've broken down some of his statements into 7 different elements that I'd like to address. They're expressed in detail in my write-up, so I'll just briefly go over those now in my oral presentation. I'd like to just address 6 of those 7. The first statement was Dr. Chimmel Curry stated that I did not take into account the internal salt budget components within the South Delta that are within the study area. And actually, to the contrary, the residual of the salt budget represents the internal sources and sinks of the salt budget. So all of the elements of the salt budget are accounted for within the model. The second element from Dr. Chimmel Curry's rebuttal testimony is that he takes issue with the fact that I used a single EC chloride relationship for each of the inflow-outflow locations within the salt budget. The data used to create the ECCH or chloride relationships represent the actual data that was collected over a long period of time at each of these locations or locations that are representative for each of the inflow and outflow points within the salt budget. This data that was collected over that period of time represents the real variability of the EC chloride relationship from the many sources that contribute flow to that location. By default, this represents the real variation in the sources that lead to each location. The third element is Dr. Chimmel Curry is concerned with the accuracy of the salt budget. The budget was based on output from the petitioner's model. Any inaccuracy in this budget would be based on the inaccuracy of the DSM-2 model itself and would apply to the salinity analyses that have been conducted in this hearing process, the EIR, EIS, and the BA. Fourth element is Dr. Chimmel Curry states that the budget residual is negative and therefore the salt must be flowing out of the South Delta. This is actually a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of what the residual of the salt budget actually represents. Dr. Chimmel Curry is thinking that the residual of the budget is actual removal of salt from the South Delta area. And what the residual represents is actually the net delta consumptive use, the seepage that occurs within the South Delta area, and the salinity that remains, or salinity change that remains within the channel. And so you can't look at the resulting positive or negative value as an inflow or net inflow or outflow, but actually just the components that are within each of those budgets for the no action alternative and the WaterFix alternative. What you need to look at is the difference between those residuals. That's showing the change that is occurring within what remains within the South Delta, given the changes that are inherent within the no action alternative and the WaterFix scenario. The fifth element I'd like to address is that Dr. Chimmel Curry misunderstands what the 30,000 metric ton increase in salt represents. That 30,000 metric tons of salt is not what was brought into the South Delta, but actually what remains in the South Delta, given the inflow and outflow of salt over that period of time. And the last element that I'd like to address is Dr. Chimmel Curry represents that EC be used to evaluate salinity rather than a salt loading budget. And I differ with that. I think that's an incorrect approach because looking at just EC would not take into account the flow-related effects of the amount of salt that's moving into or out of the system. By looking at the flow, an EC of, say, 5 or 10 or 100 would have a much different effect if it was associated with a flow of 10 CFS versus if that same EC was associated with a flow of 100 or 1,000 CFS. Therefore, you need to take the volume weighting component of that EC in order to understand what the true mass of salt is that's moving through the system. And that's all my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. All right, DWR had requested actually a joint cross with state water contractors for 60 minutes.
I'm just going to take a second to get organized. Good morning.
Good morning.
Happy new water year. And there's rain in the forecast, so we should all be happy. I have some questions about, and it really just tracks the points that Mr. Burke makes, so it's just going to be walking through mostly in order of his testimony. In your rebuttal testimony, SDWA 328, the WaterFix scenario you say you use for the salt budget analysis is CWF H3+, correct?
No, I believe this is related to the preferred alternative, the PA, CWF-PA, because this was, the salt budget was developed before the H3+ was issued.
So if we could look at your testimony on page 7. Looking at line 11. So your CWF H3+ is actually CWF BA H3+. That's
correct.
So is it fair to assume that any reference in SDWA 328 that says CWF H3+ is the modeling BA CWF H3?
The modeling was actually conducted on the BA H3+, but in our analysis of the BA H3+ and CWF H3+, we found very little difference in the salinity elements for the model.
Oh, good. I have questions for you about that. So you're still using, for your rebuttal testimony, the salt budget analysis that you referenced in your rebuttal testimony as SDWA 291, correct?
That's correct.
And in SDWA 291, when you refer to CWF PA, that's the BA H3+ modeling as well?
It was referred to as the preferred alternative at that time.
So yes?
I believe so.
Okay. And when you refer to CWF H3+ in your, I'm sorry, do you know that the exports in the salt budget area changed between BA H3+ and CWF H3+?
Yes, I do.
But you didn't repeat the salt budget analysis for CWF H3+, correct?
No, the rebuttal and the surrebuttal was based on the original SDWA 291, which was conducted before CWF H3+ was made available.
So you know that they changed, but you never did the analysis?
In the analysis that we've done on previous review of the salinity of elements within the South Delta, we saw very little change in the salinity that we saw within the system. And so we feel that the CWF H3+ and the BA H3+ will produce basically a similar results.
So I'm sorry, I'm confused. I'm going to go back because I think I misunderstood your answer then. So your testimony is that the exports and the salt budget would not change between BA H3+ and CWF H3+.
Not significantly in terms of what the salt loading would be to the South Delta area.
And what do you mean by not significantly?
I don't believe that the changes that we've seen within the components of the H3 Plus for BA and the CWF H3 Plus are significant enough to change the elements within the SALT budget based on our review of the salinity levels at different points within the South Delta.
But you didn't redo your SALT budget analysis with the CWF H3 Plus modeling, correct?
No, we didn't completely redo the analysis.
What do you mean by completely?
That means do it from scratch with the new model.
So what portions did you look at?
In previous analysis, what we've done is looked at salinity levels at different locations within the South Delta.
Between CWF H3 Plus and BA H3 Plus?
That's correct.
And where did you produce this analysis?
I don't believe we produced that analysis in terms of a comparison. It's just our own internal review of what we saw when we looked at the two models.
Why didn't you produce it?
Because we didn't see a significant change.
Can you produce it now?
No, I don't have it with me.
Can you make it available?
I'm going to object to that. He's responding in his rebuttal to Dr. Chilmacurry's rebuttal, which was clearly based on the Part 2 alternative prior to CWF H3 Plus. So his testimony is pretty clear in that regard. We're not going to start producing internal analyses that were just basically sensitivity analyses that demonstrate there's little or no difference, which supports his testimony.
Mr. Burke just testified that based on that analysis, he finds that there is little to no difference between the H3 Plus and BA modeling. And so if he's opining about that, I'd like to be able to see the analysis and make it produce and have it produced.
Overruled, Ms. Morris. What he considered in producing his what he considered not relevant to his sur rebuttal testimony is then outside the scope of his sur rebuttal testimony.
Right, but in his testimony, he's claiming that they would be similar, so it is within the scope.
I'm sorry, are you lodging a motion for reconsideration?
Yes.
Okay, just for the record.
I'm sorry, Ms. Morris. I'm trying to follow your line of logic. He did an analysis that, in his opinion, did not show it, well, he believed it was not relevant to his sur rebuttal testimony, therefore he did not include it in his sur rebuttal testimony, and now you're suggesting that it be provided.
But he's actually opining. I just asked him, and he said they're similar. So what he believes is similar, without being able to describe to me what the differences are, we're not able to evaluate whether that's accurate or whether we would agree that they're similar. And a lot of this testimony, as you can see, deals with 5 to 10% changes or small percents, and there's disagreement among the experts. And so my argument is that it is relevant because he's now saying that the modeling without running the SALT budget analysis again, that the changes between CWF H3 Plus and the BA were not significant.
Ms. Ainsley?
I was merely going to add that Mr. Burke's conclusions here in his sur rebuttal testimony are specifically to CWF H3 Plus and not to the BA H3 Plus modeling. So he is making the leap now and providing expert opinion on the actual salinity budget, I guess, for CWF H3 Plus, because that was the purpose of Ms. Morris's original clarifying question, so that we could understand where this analysis comes from, basically, because now he's using the term CWF H3 Plus.
Mr. Ruiz.
Yes, what Mr. Burke decided as not being relevant or what he didn't use, there's many things he probably didn't use. If he didn't use it, it's not part of his sur rebuttal testimony. It's outside of the scope. If she wants to ask questions, as she has, about why does he refer to CWF H3 Plus versus the previous PA, she can do that, and he's responded to that, but he does not have to produce anything that he's done internally. There's many things he's done that are not part of his sur rebuttal testimony.
And there's many things petitioners have done that are not part of this request for reconsideration denied.
But you do agree that in your testimony, when you refer to CWF H3 Plus, it's based on the BA H3 Plus modeling, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
And in my professional opinion, I feel that in terms of a SALT budget, they would be relatively the same.
But you haven't produced the analysis to verify that, have you?
Objection asked and answered, argumentative.
Sustained.
Did you or your staff rerun the petitioner's no action alternative and BAH3 plus DSM2 models to get the EC values needed for your salt budget analysis?
And I'm going to object just in vagueness in terms of time. Are you mean originally or in preparation for a rebuttal testimony?
Originally, and this is within the scope because he refers to his testimony at 291, and his rebuttal analysis is based on the same analysis.
All right. Mr. Burke?
Yes, we did rerun the petitioner's models because we needed to insert outputs at the exact locations where we're doing an inflow and outflow to the South Delta area. The original model didn't have output locations for those points that we thought were important. We didn't change any of the internal components of the model. We just changed how much information was being output from the model so that it matched up with the locations that we were calculating the salt budget for.
So which version of DSM2 did you use to rerun the NAA and BAH3 plus models?
We were using the 8.06.
And just to be clear, you did not submit the NAA and BAH3 models that you reran or the EC outputs that you used for your analysis into the record, correct?
I don't believe that those were submitted as exhibits for the salt budget analysis.
Did you show anywhere in your testimony if your reruns of the NAA and the BAH3 plus provided exactly the same results as the petitioners?
I'm going to object. That misstates his testimony and lacks foundation.
Mr. Reese, I can barely hear you.
I'm sorry, objection. It misstates his testimony and lacks foundation.
How do you believe it we misstate his testimony?
Well, I believe she used the term exactly the same, and I don't think he said anything was exactly the same.
All right. Ms. Morris, rephrase, please.
It's a different context of the question. I'm not asking again about his opinion between the CWF H3 Plus and the BA, where he said they were similar but not exactly the same. What I'm asking now is whether if he showed anywhere in his testimony that the reruns of the NAA and BAH3 provided exactly the same results as the petitioner's DSM2 modeling.
And the word exactly is important?
Well, in his rebuttal testimony, he says that he just orally said that he used the petitioner's model and it didn't change. So I'm trying to confirm that.
All right.
Yeah, I withdraw that aspect of it. Exactly, I had misunderstood in terms of the context.
All right. Mr. Burke will answer, but before he does, Mr. Derringer, if you could move your name tag that way so I don't have to see Ms. Morris a little bit more. Thank you. All right. Mr. Burke.
I'm sorry, after all that, could you repeat the question, please?
I will repeat the question. Did you show anywhere in your testimony if your reruns of the NAA and BAH3 Plus provided exactly the same results as petitioner's modeling?
I don't believe we went back and tried to verify that the petitioner's numbers were correct. Since we didn't change any of the model itself except the output locations, we didn't go back and try to verify that the model submitted or the results from our model matched what was originally submitted by the petitioners.
So you didn't show it in your testimony, correct?
And I was going to say this testimony speaks for itself. It's clear what's in his testimony and what's not.
Let's just answer it then. It's not in his testimony.
No, I didn't include that in my testimony.
And then I want to just, the next set of questions, when I say the South Delta budget area or South Delta subregion, I'm talking about the subregion delineated on SDWA 291, figure 1, if we could pull that up. I just want to make sure you're okay with that characterization, or we can call it whatever you'd like, but for ease of asking the next set of questions. So do you agree that we can just call this the South Delta subregion or South Delta budget area?
Yeah, that's a rough map that outlines the area. I would agree with that terminology.
And it's your map, though?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
The salt budget analysis, which is the subject of your rebuttal testimony, only includes chlorides, correct?
That's correct.
It doesn't include bromides, sulfates, or other salt components.
No, it doesn't.
Mr. Burke, in your calculations of your salt budget for South Delta, you did not include the salt mass associated with agricultural diversions, return flows, and seepage, correct?
I did, actually. Those components are what the residual actually is equivalent to. The residual the residual represents those components.
Okay, let's go and look at your testimony, SDWA 291, page 6. And isn't it true that this table 1 is showing what the inputs were to your South Delta water budget components?
These are the external inputs to the South Delta water budget. That's correct.
And where can I find that it says agricultural diversions?
Agricultural diversions aren't an external input to the South Delta budget. It's the internal residual of what's left over in the South Delta budget.
So you're saying that you considered ag diversions, return flows, and seepage because they are necessarily the output of your calculation?
That's correct. It's the residual of the external loading to the South Delta.
And looking at SDWA 328, page 4, lines 2 to 4, you say that the difference between the NAA and BAH3 are relatively minor for the salt associated with ag diversion and seepage flows, correct?
That's correct.
Did you present any analysis to show that the difference in the salt mass for the agricultural diversions and seepage is minor between the NAA and BAH3+?
No, I was just assuming that the project alternative of the H3+ scenario would not have dramatic impact on the agricultural production in the South Delta, so that it wouldn't have any difference or an impact on those loading and return rates.
But we're not talking about agricultural use, we're talking about a salt load analysis, correct?
Well, when you're talking about salt load analysis, you need to determine what the agricultural use is or the consumptive use within the delta. You can't leave that out of your calculations.
So, but you didn't actually analyze any agricultural production, you just assumed it was the same?
No, I left that as the residual of the budget. It wasn't necessary to analyze exactly what the inflow or outflow was. It is the residual of the budget.
Looking at SDWA 328, page 7, lines 8 through 12, here you show the two equations to calculate the residual salt for the NAA and the BAH3+, correct?
That's correct.
And you have two terms labeled consumptive use and seepage, correct?
That's correct.
Is it correct to say that these two terms represent the amount of salt mass leaving the budget area either through agricultural diversions or seepage in that region?
The consumptive use actually has two terms in it. One is a withdrawal term for the irrigation diversions, and another is a return flow. The diversion is a salt loss to the system, and the return flow is a salt addition to the system.
Would those two have the same EC?
No, they don't.
You assume that these two terms, consumptive use and seepage for the NAA and the BAH3+, are identical, correct?
No, I didn't say identical, but I said they're going to be similar.
Referring to what you labeled as consumptive use and seepage in your equation in SDWA 328, page 7, to compute the salt mass for these two terms, the volume of agricultural diversions and seepage should be multiplied by the corresponding salinity at locations where the diversion and seepage are occurring, correct?
That's correct.
And the flow volume is a DSM-2 input and therefore is identical for the NAA and BH3+, correct?
Which flow volume are you referring to?
I'm looking at your testimony on page 3, SDWA 328, page 3, lines 22 through 24. You are talking about the flow values assigned for the 3 components.
Let me take a look at that for a second. Okay, that's correct.
Okay. And you, in fact, have testified that there's a substantial increase in EC in the South Delta area under the CWF compared to the no action alternative, correct?
That's correct.
Did you present the analysis showing that the flows would be minor?
I'm just going to object to the question. It's vague and ambiguous.
Let me try to re-ask the question. Did you present the analysis showing that the differences in flows would be minor?
No, I didn't present the analysis because my analysis was based on the data produced by the petitioners in their model. And if you look at the flow data in the model, they're identical.
You used the same EC chloride conversion equations for the NAA and BaH3+ in your salt budget analysis, correct?
That's correct.
Would you say the same EC chloride equation can be used for conducting the salt budget analysis for any of the CWF scenarios that have been presented for this hearing?
I think there's too many variables involved for me to analyze or answer that correctly.
I'm sorry. One second.
There's too many unknowns in just saying all scenarios. I had to look at each one individually to see what that scenario represents and how it's being modeled to know whether that would be the correct EC chloride relationship to use for that particular scenario.
Okay, I just thought because you said in your testimony that you would use the same one to make sure there was no bias due to the conversions when comparing the CWF to the NAA, that would also be true for boundary 1, boundary H3+, H4, and boundary 2. Is that not accurate?
Well, now you're listing the actual scenarios that I know of. Before it was just any scenario. For those scenarios, the B1, B2, H3, and H4, I would probably use the same EC chloride scenarios for each of those.
And looking at your testimony on page 4, line 27, when you say each source, you mean each component of table 1 in SDWA 291, correct?
Let me take a look at that for a second, please.
Can we go back to the table, please, Mr. Hunt?
Okay, I've looked at it.
I'm sorry, do I need to restate the question?
Pardon?
Do I need to restate the question?
I'm not sure if we ever got to a question. You were just referring to.
Oh, no, the question was, when we're looking at page 4 of your SIR rebuttal testimony, when you say each source, do you mean each component is listed on table 1 of SDWA 291? Is that what you mean by each source?
I believe so, yes.
And looking at SDWA 291, pages 10 and 11, so let's start with 10, sorry. Equations 3, 4, 5, and 6 are what you use to convert EC to chloride, correct?
That's correct.
You use different equations for different salt components in your analysis.
I use different equations for different locations in my analysis.
And you didn't use the same equation for all the salt components because the source of flow and salt would be different for each component in your analysis, correct?
That's correct.
And that's because the source of water and salt at those 2 locations is different, correct?
That's correct.
So if there's a large shift in the source of water under CWF scenario compared to the NAA for each flow component in your analysis, you should not be using the same EC chloride conversions, correct?
If you had a large change in the distribution of flows from different sources at a specific location, you would probably want to modify your equation to reflect that. But we've looked at the change in source components to each of these locations, and the largest change we saw was 0.3% for the Martinez flow going to Old River. We didn't think that was a significant enough change, only 0.3%, to modify the equation.
But if, for example, the no action alternative had a component of, let's say, 50% of Sacramento water and 50% San Joaquin water, and the California WaterFix had a change of 30% Sacramento water and 70% San Joaquin water, you would necessarily need to change your chloride concentrations, correct? Or equations, apologies.
I'm going to object as incomplete hypothetical.
Are you able to answer the question, Mr. Burke?
Yeah, if you had a large change like that, you might want to evaluate whether or not you had to change your ECCL relationship. But you'd have to look at what the different sources are and the volume of change for each source to know whether or not it's a significant enough change to modify your equation.
Okay. Looking at SDWA 291, figure 3, page 12. It shows the EC chloride conversion equation you use for both Old River and Middle River flow components, correct?
That's correct.
And figure 3 is an example of the best, what you've characterized as the best fit on the EC to chloride relationship that you developed for the Middle River at Borden Bridge, correct?
It's based on the collected data at that location. That rest represents the mix of sources and the concentrations of EC and CL at that location.
Under historical conditions?
That's correct.
And just because, for my own clarity, so I can make sure connecting the dots, the line on this figure is your equation, and the dots are the historical observations, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. And you indicate that on this figure that there's an R squared of 0.94, and that you think it's a strike all of that. Sorry, tongue-tied. You indicate an R squared of 0.94, and would you agree that that is statistically a good fit?
I would agree that generally looking at the distribution of dots around the fit line and the R squared together, that looks like a good fit to me.
And yet some individual data points have a fair amount of scatter, correct?
That's correct.
So just as an example, if we look at the value on the bottom of EC at 400, and we look across at the chloride, on your equation, it shows it would be the chloride at 60, correct? That's where
correct.
the line intersects with your equation?
That's correct.
And visually, I can see that there's points above and below that that vary from between 48 to 72. Would you agree?
That's correct.
So there can be up to a 20% variation among the data points, even with a fairly good statistical fit, correct?
That's what the natural variability of ECCL is showing us at that location.
So that means that the real chloride concentrations can differ up to 20% at the 400 EC, correct?
Based on the collected data that we see here, yes.
It appears for all data points corresponding to EC levels below about 240. So if I look at the bottom line of this figure, about 240, and move up to your equation line, that the actual chloride concentrations were higher than the estimated line, correct?
For those low EC levels, that's correct.
So at this location, you would be likely under-predicting the chloride concentration if the EC values were below 240.
That's correct, you would be. But you would be applying this equation to both scenarios so that you wouldn't achieve any bias in your comparison.
And this plotting of data points does not take into consideration any hydrological variation, does it?
Yes, it does. It represents all of the hydrological variation that's been experienced at that point over the period of record where data was collected.
Right. That's a nice interpretation of my question. Let me try again. I didn't ask a very clear question. It doesn't consider differing hydrology because it simply takes into account all the data points. So for example, I could not look at one point and say whether or not that occurred in a dry period or a wet period or a high flow or a low flow, could I?
Not from this chart alone, no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for forcing me to ask hard or better questions. Looking at SDWA 291, I'm sorry, we already confirmed that's the location. Well, let's just pull it up anyway, sorry. SDWA 291, figure 1, page 8. And that's the boundary location for your salt budget area, correct?
That's correct.
And one of this boundaries is labeled Old River. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Is it correct that you use the same EC chloride conversion you developed for Middle River to calculate the salt flux at Old River?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any evidence in your testimony to show that the EC chloride relationship at Old River is identical to the Middle River location?
I don't have any evidence in my testimony to say that they're identical, but I believe they are comparable in my professional opinion.
But you didn't show that analysis in any of your testimony for Part 2 or this rebuttal testimony, correct?
No, I didn't.
And similarly, you used the equation for Vernalis and Burns cut locations the same, correct?
That's correct.
In SDWA 328, page 5, lines 5 to 6, you're referring to figure 3 of DWR 932. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it correct that you are saying the largest change in the monthly average percentage contribution from Martinez is 0.1 to 0.2%?
That's correct.
And you believe this small change is not going to affect the EC chloride relationship, correct?
No, it's not going to change the EC chloride relationship significantly.
And looking at DWR 932, figure 3 on page 11, okay, thanks. Looking at this figure, it shows the long-term average monthly Martinez contributions for boundary 1, H3, H4, and boundary 2, correct?
That's correct.
And this obviously doesn't include CWF H3 plus, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree that the Martinez contribution represents the effects of seawater?
I'm not sure what you mean by effects.
In DSM-2, isn't Martinez considered the boundary for ocean water?
That's correct.
So let's focus on a comparison of, in this figure, of NAA to H3. So NAA being the blue and H3 being the green. Looking at the month of November, between the blue and the green line, do you agree there's about a 0.5% difference in the Martinez contribution between the NAA and the H3?
That's true. It looks like it is about a 0.5.
And would you agree for the months of January and August, the difference is about 0.3%?
It could be. It's hard to read from the graph, but I would
Roughly?
concede that generally around that.
So, in fact, then, isn't it true that your statement on page 5, lines 5 to 9, is not correct?
It's a little low. I agree.
Do you agree that a small change in contribution from Martinez, say 0.5%, which represents the seawater contribution, may have a not so small effect on EC and chloride?
It will have a larger effect on chloride and a much smaller effect on the EC chloride relationship. And my analysis takes into account that effect on EC.
Okay, looking at, sorry, Mr. Hunt, we're going to have to go on a little adventure here. State Water Resources Control Board 102. And it's going to be in Chapter 8. So you need to go, yeah, perfect. And then Chapter 8. Water quality, top one, Chapter 8, perfect. And then it's PDF page 171. Oops. Perfect, okay. And looking at this SWRCB 102, do you see that the San Francisco Bay, which is at Martinez, shows a range of average chloride between 3,757 and 9,414 milligrams per liter?
And I'm going to object to this line of questioning. This is getting outside of the scope of his rebuttal testimony. I don't think he referred to this or relied on this or mentioned this in his testimony.
Ms. Morris?
I'm testing, he's challenging Dr. Chilmacurry's challenge or criticism of his testimony about the proper chloride concentration, and what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that there are differences in equations, and that there are differences between the contributions from the ocean at Martinez that he did not take into account.
Overrule Mr. Ruiz. She may pull up documents in her cross-examination.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. This shows a range of average chloride concentration at Martinez between 3,757 and 9,414 milligrams per liter, correct?
That's correct.
Assuming a value of 9,414 milligrams per liter chloride concentration at Martinez, would you agree that a 0.5% of Martinez contribution based on a concentration at that high level is approximately 47 milligrams per liter?
I can't do those calcs in my head, but
Do you have a phone where you can do it, or do you agree that if I take 9,414 and times it by 0.5%, that I'm going to get roughly 47 milligrams per liter of chloride?
No, I'm going to object as incomplete
I'm sorry.
hypothetical, and whether or not she can pull up documents that's still outside of the scope of his rebuttal testimony.
She is allowed to test the basis of his testimony by pulling up her exhibits. So, but I believe the
concede to your
witness has
calculation.
answered he can't do math that fast in his head, Ms. Morris.
but I'll concede to your calculation.
What about at 1%? That'd be more easier.
Okay.
Easier math.
Okay.
What would be the change in the chloride concentration?
So at 1%, that would be 941.
So, and then we have to divide that by 100, so it would be 9.4.
Okay.
Okay. 94. I should never do math. 94, correct?
That's correct.
And SWRCB 102, it also shows that the San Joaquin River chloride concentration, if we're looking at that column, it seems on the mean, 81.4, is roughly 12 times greater than the Sacramento River, correct?
That's correct.
And referring to, if you could look at Stockton 26, and I have printed these out. I want to pull it up, but I want to be able Okay, and these are, if you could go to PDF page.
Could we establish what this is and whether Dr. Burke is familiar with it?
This is Exhibit Stockton 26 that is in evidence as Susan Paulson's report on the effects of California WaterFix. Is that what you see on the screen, Mr. Burke? And
See the label on the report?
You're familiar with DSM-2 fingerprinting, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you are able to look at and read results from DSM-2 fingerprinting, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm going to show you some DSM fingerprinting from this exhibit. And if we could go to Stockton 26 page, PDF page 223.
And I'm going to object for the record as to this. Mr. Burke isn't familiar with this exhibit and has not reviewed this exhibit.
We'll take that into consideration.
Okay, and I'm not, and so this says source fingerprinting, source water fingerprints at Buckley Cove, correct? On the screen? Okay. And what I want to do is if you can go also to now to PDF page 225. And then if you can focus on the, I can't do that right now. Okay, so I want to look at the two, and the reason I printed them out for you is the other one that you have listed as exhibit is A marked is an excerpt on PDF page 247, sorry, and of that same exhibit. And the reason that we have to look at them this way is that this shows the NAA on the one that's been marked B as red, and it shows the alternative 4A as orange on a separate sheet. And I want to direct your attention at first to the Sacramento River water dry year on both exhibits, which is the top left box. Do you see those?
I see that.
Okay. And the Sacramento River contribution in the dry year for July is 20% greater is 20% for the NAA, correct?
I'm not sure which plot you're looking at.
I'm looking at, I think it's confusing, but I'm looking at what's on the screen in the top left corner and what's been marked in front of you as section B of Stockton 26.
Okay, I see the top left graph.
And it shows that the contribution of Sacramento River water at Buckley Cove is 20% in July, correct?
That's correct.
And if we look at what's been marked as Stockton 26, but what I've shown you is A, which is not currently on the screen, but you have in front of you, on the top left, it shows that the alternative for A, that the contribution of Sacramento River water in dry years for alternative for A is between 0 and 1%, correct?
Can we just slow down and object for the record? I'm trying to figure out what is A, or if we're looking at the same thing.
Mr. Reese, you need to pull the microphone closer.
I'm sorry, I'm objecting because I'm not sure that we have the same information, or at least for the record, I'm not clear. This says Stockton 26, and you said something about marked as A.
On the cover sheet of what she handed you, there's an A and there's a B.
Okay.
It's all in the same exhibit. The reason that I printed
Different
it out was so
pages.
that you could compare the two, so it might be easier for people to see, but I was trying to make it easier, not more confusing.
Actually, I think Mr. Hunt has found a way to put both on the screen.
Okay. So if you could go to, on one of the
Actually, no,
screens,
Mr.
if
Hunt,
you go
on
to
one-
PDF page.
Yeah, go to page 245.
47.
245 on yours.
There we go. Okay, so what, do you need me to re-ask the question now?
Yes. Well,
Yes,
I
please.
request that you do.
Okay, so looking at the Sacramento River water contribution at Buckley Cove in a dry water year in July, it shows a 20% contribution, correct?
That's correct.
For the NAA, correct?
For the NAA, that's correct.
Right, but looking at the second screen on the right, which is PDF page 247 of the same exhibit, for alternative 4A, it shows that the Sacramento contribution is somewhere between, in July, at about between 0 and 1%, correct?
That's correct.
And then similarly, if we look at the San Joaquin River on the no action alternative, so the one to your left on PDF page 225. The San Joaquin River contribution in a dry year for July is 45% under the NAA, correct?
In July?
In July.
About 50, actually, but
it's if you look at the line, 50. Oh yeah, it's a little bit lower than 50. Okay, roughly. And then if we look at PDF page 267, in July it shows it's about 60%, correct? For the alternative 4A?
close to 60, yes.
Okay. So the contribution from the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and from Martinez change under the CWF is different than the NAA, correct?
That's correct.
So it's not possible that 99% of the flow will have the same EC chloride relationship as the NAA, correct?
I'm not sure if they understand the statement.
In your testimony, 328, page 5, lines 6 through 9, you say that the small of a change can affect the salinity concentration, but changing 0.1% of the data is not going to have a significant effect on the development of the EC salinity relationship, especially considering that 99.8 to 99% of the flow will have the same EC chloride relationship. So looking at what we've looked at the different sources, it's not possible that 99% of the flow will have the same EC chloride relationship between the BaH3+ and the NAA, correct?
You're confusing the EC calculations, which take into the difference in the volume of flow coming from the different sources, which we did take into account in our analysis. You're confusing that with the EC chloride relationship in order to produce chloride from an EC value. Now, the dominant flow in there will be what flow is driving that EC chloride relationship. If you put 1 or 2 or 3% Martinez flow in there, you will dramatically increase the EC, but you're not going to dramatically change the EC chloride relationship. And we are accounting for that increase in EC due to the change in flow source. But it's not having a dramatic effect on the EC chloride relationship.
If the salt mass associated with the ag diversions and seepage for the NAA and BaH3+ is different, and they were accounted for in your analysis, wouldn't the 30,000 metric tons you are reporting change?
Not at all. What we're seeing here is the actual change in what's the residual of that salt budget from the different scenarios. How that salt is affected by seepage, drainage, or irrigation usage or consumptive use is intrinsic to that residual value. We're only interested in what the difference in that residual is. We're not trying to evaluate how that residual for any different scenario is being utilized.
Let me take a step back and see if I can understand this. What I was pointing out to you is that there appears to be significant changes, up to 20%, in the sources of the water in different scenarios, correct?
That's correct, and we're taking that into account in our analysis.
But you didn't change the chloride conversion calculation. You used the same one, correct?
For the sources that we looked at, the change in the source value for each of these calculation points for the salt budget were not significant enough to have a dramatic effect on the EC chloride relationship. It does change the EC, but it does not have a significant change on the EC-CL relationship, given the dominant amount of water coming from other sources.
Looking at SDWA page 328, page 9, lines 14 through 16. Here you're referring to the you're referring to SDW 878 and stating that during the summer period, salinity values for H3 scenario is higher than the NAA 90% of the time, correct?
That's correct.
But if we could please pull up SDWA 78, page 22.
If you go to view, you should be able to rotate it.
I'm looking for page 22.
Rotate.
PDF page 24, sorry. That might help you. That's not the right one. There we go. Now you have to rotate it back. Okay. Looking at this table, is this where you got the information about the increase in the EC being 90%?
For H3 plus or H3, that's correct.
And that's just for summer of 1977, correct?
That's correct.
So your statement was specifically about Old River at Tracy site too, correct?
That's correct.
And so essentially you're making a generalized statement as to 1 year and 1 location.
Well, we're saying that the salinity levels could be as high as 90%.
But it's based on 1 year and 1 location, correct?
For a worst case scenario, that's correct.
Okay. And looking at SDWA 328, page 9, lines 14 through 16. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip that. Actually, I think I'm almost done, but I need to go through my notes. If we could take a quick break and then I could finish up, that would be really helpful.
All right, we'll take a quick break until, how much time do you need? 11:50? Okay. All right, we're back.
I'm going to try this, and then I may have to turn over to my technical advisor.
Okay.
Okay, so SDWA 328, if you could pull that up on page 7. And then, Mr. Birkin, just to confirm, I think that you testified earlier that your equation does take into consideration ag diversions, seepage, and return flows from ag diversions because those are necessarily the outputs of this equation, correct? The residual.
The way we've set our equation up is to have the residual equal to the net consumptive use and seepage and remaining salt within the channels.
So that means, I mean, just looking at this, and I'm trying to simplify this, so looking at the consumptive use portions between the NAA and the CWF BAH3+, you essentially, I think you testified that the consumptive use, essentially, you accounted for that as the same. So in between these formulas, that would both be the same.
No, I accounted for the flows for the consumptive use as being the same, but the salinity for the consumptive use changes depending on the parameter that you're evaluating within the consumptive use.
Right, okay, so so the flows are the same, but it's true, you did testify that the ECs would be different.
The EC for the irrigation diversion would be based on the EC in the channel at the time the diversion occurs, but the EC for the return flow is a fixed value within the DSM-2 model.
And it doesn't change between the two equations, correct? Because
That's
it's an
correct.
input.
Yeah.
So if I understand your testimony correctly, if I go to the equal side, that the 48,693 million tons and the 18,370 million tons, metric tons, that includes the ag diversions, the seepage, the return flows, and the existing salts that are leaving from, and the change in the existing salts from the area, correct?
It's the existing salt within the channels in the South Delta.
So it includes all 4 of those things.
That's correct.
So how can you tell that the 30 metric tons in your equation is all attributable solely to the California WaterFix?
Because it's looking at those flow components of the water fix that are affecting salinity that enter or exit the South Delta area.
So it doesn't look, you're only looking at the flow components, you're not looking at the salt components?
Well, the flow and the salt components that come together at the boundaries of the South Delta study area.
Okay, I'm turning it over.
Mr. Burke, on line 20, you're showing that the salt mass change for under WaterFix compared to the no action alternative will be 30,000 metric tons, correct?
That's correct.
Now, scroll back up to lines 8 through 12, please. And you just said that the salinity in the South Delta is changing, correct?
That's correct.
So the salt load associated with the ag diversions is also changing, correct?
Not necessarily. It can change if the salinity within the channel changes, and so the diversion would pull more salt in if the salinity in the channel was increasing.
So which is correct then? Is the salinity changing or the salt load is not changing? Which one of the two statements that you just made is correct?
I'm going to object as asked and answered.
Mr. Reese, please allow Mr. Burke to answer because it will help me.
Actually, I was going to ask you if you could repeat the question, please.
So you just told me that the salinity in the South Delta channels will increase, correct?
That's correct.
But you're also saying that the salt load associated with the ag diversions in the South Delta channels would not change, correct?
No, I didn't say that.
Didn't say that.
You said it may not change, correct?
The return flow will not change, but the irrigation diversion could change.
Okay, so the irrigation diversion salt load will change is what you're saying, correct?
I'm saying it could change.
it could change. Okay, that's fine. So how do you know that the 30,000 metric tons that you're showing on line 20 is entirely related to WaterFix if the ag diversion's salt load could change?
Because the residual for the project alternative already takes into account what the ag diversions will be for that particular scenario and the salinity that's in the channel for that scenario. And so now we're just taking the difference between those two scenarios, which comes out to be 30,000 metric tons. How that 30,000 metric tons is divided among the residual, is more of it going into irrigation diversions, is more of it going into the channel salinity. We haven't siphoned or filtered those two elements out. We just know that somehow between consumptive use, seepage, and channel salinity, they're going to have to accept 30,000 more metric tons divided over those components.
I think I have just one more question. Okay, I think about 5 to 6 more questions. If we could pull up SDWA 328, page 8. So actually, we've already established that, so maybe we'll go to the additional amount of 30,000 metric tons of salt over time should lead to an increase in EC within your defined salt budget region, correct?
Could you rephrase that, please?
I'll restate it. The additional amount of salt over time should lead to an increase in EC within your defined salt budget region, correct?
I would expect that to happen. That's correct.
And in fact, over time, if your analysis is accurate, one should expect a larger and larger accumulation of salt in the salt budget region under the BA H3+ as compared to the no action alternative, correct?
Not necessarily, because as I stated earlier, there are 3 components where that salt could go. It could go into channel salinity, it could be sucked up by irrigation diversions, or it could go down into seepage. How it's split among those 3 components, I don't really know. We didn't filter that out. But if it stays as salinity within the channel, it's an impact. If it gets sucked into the irrigation diversions and goes on the field, that's an impact. So we just left that all together as the potential impact due to the increase in salinity within the South Delta area.
Because to oversimplify it, inside the box, you looked at what's coming in and what's going out, but you didn't determine what was going on in the box, correct?
Yeah, there's 3 little balls bouncing around in that box, and we didn't determine which of those 3 little balls got the increase in salinity or increase in salt.
Okay. And you looked at an 82-year DSM-2 simulation from 1922 to 2003, correct?
That's correct.
And if we look at SDW 328, page 10, figure 1, you provided this figure showing the difference in EC between the H3+, BA H3+, and the NAA based on DSM-2 results for water year 1973, correct?
I believe this particular figure was based on the CWF H3+ and the NAA. It was produced after the CWF H3+ model was available.
So you do have modeling for CWF H3+, and you are relying it on in this testimony. This is not the BA H3+ modeling?
The modeling that went into the salt budget is the BA preferred alternative for the WaterFix scenario at that time. This figure was brought into the testimony to show that there are going to be increases in salinity within the channel system based on the residual salt that's left over from the salt budget.
Okay, so with that correction, you're showing CWF H3 plus and NAA based on the DSM-2 results for water year 1973.
That's correct.
And from the start of the DSM-2 simulation in 1922, 1973 is the 51st year in that simulation, roughly, correct?
Roughly, that's correct.
Okay, good. Based on your analysis, by this time, roughly 30,000 metric tons per year, so times 51, which is approximately 1.5 million metric tons of additional salt would have accumulated in the South Delta region under the BA H3 plus versus the NAA, correct?
Not necessarily, because as we mentioned earlier, there's three components. That salt, as it accumulates within the South Delta, is being taken out through seepage. Some of it's being taken out of the system through irrigation diversions. Some of it remains in the system as increased salinity, which is what's shown here on this figure.
But we can't really account for that in your salt budget analysis, because as those three dots that are bouncing around in the box, you didn't do any analysis, correct?
And that's been asked and answered multiple times.
And since it's a complicated matter, let's confirm that, please, Mr. Burke.
No, we didn't try to parse out what was being absorbed into the channel versus what was being drawn into fields versus what was being was seeping into the ground below the delta, because we felt that all three of those components are all impacts in their own right, and therefore can be lumped together as an impact due to the H3 plus model.
And looking again at figure 1, and do you see in December of 1972 that there is in fact a very small difference between EC, between the CWF H3 plus and the NAA at this location?
Would you repeat what month that was?
It's December 1972. It's the one that has basically a flat line at 0.
Yeah, I see that. Okay.
Can you answer the question?
I'm sorry, what? Could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, isn't it true that in December, there's basically a very small difference in the EC between the CWF H3 plus and the no action alternative?
For that particular month, that's correct.
And at that location?
And at that location.
So, and in fact, for a short period of, for the months of June and July, on this figure, CWF H3 plus is actually lower in EC as compared to the no action alternative.
That's correct, and that's why we use monthly averages, because some years are going to have a higher influx of salt and some years are going to have a lower influx of salt, resulting in different salinity concentrations within the channel.
Looking at SDWA 291, Table 3 and Table 4. These are monthly. These show monthly value for an 82-year average, correct?
They show mean monthly values for the 82-year.
I'm sorry. Each monthly value is an 82-year average, though, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And looking at your testimony 328, page 10, lines 24 to 25, if the averages for two scenarios are not showing differences, doesn't this mean that there are years with lower salinity, even if some of the years show increases?
Could you repeat that, please?
If looking at your testimony 328, page 10, lines 24 to 25.
Okay.
If the averages for two scenarios are not showing differences, doesn't that mean that there are years with lower salinity, even if some years show increases in salinity?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question.
Mr. Burke, you showed one example of the year water year 1973 as salinity increasing under CWF H3+, correct?
Just as an example of showing increased salinities in the South Delta.
And you're saying in this testimony right here that if you average on a long term, the differences would be minor, right?
It all depends on how you're using those averages. If you're looking at instantaneous values, an average might not give you a correct value. But when you're looking at a cumulative aggregation of salt that occurs from month to month, then it's actually more appropriate to use an average monthly value.
So your use of average is different than what I used?
Yeah, because you're not looking
I'm just
at...
object as vague and ambiguous.
Actually, it might be helpful if Mr. Burke could clarify.
Okay.
Please.
It is. And the reason why it's more appropriate to use averages when you're looking at this is because we are looking at a cumulative aggregation of values as you go from month to month through the year. You're taking these averages and saying this is just going to be an instantaneous value, and therefore there's no impact based on that averaging. The impact that we're looking at here comes from the accumulation of salt over the time period that we're running our model for.
But before you accumulated that month to month to month, you actually averaged the data for 82 years, correct? For individual months?
That's correct.
Just going back to your page 7 of your testimony and the equations on lines 8 through 12.
I'm going to see this equation in my sleep now, Mr. Burke.
I already see these equations in my sleep.
Just one question, really. Dr. Burke, would the EC chloride conversions be the same for all the ag diversions in the South Delta region?
Probably not, because there are different locations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Between Ms. Desjardins, Ms. Meserve, and Mr. Jackson. All right. Ms. Desjardins, then. All right. Thank you, Mr. Hunt. Ms. Desjardins requested 15 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt,
Microphone, please.
Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. Good afternoon, Mr. Burke. Mr. Hunt, can you bring up Exhibit DWR 1217, page 29? Mr. Burke, you criticize Dr. Chilmacurry's figure 11 in his rebuttal testimony, correct? On page 16 of your testimony.
That's correct.
Ms. Desjardins, you really need to
I
bring the
apologize.
microphone
On
in.
page and this is the figure on page 16 of your testimony. You criticize this, and you call this figure a classic example of the improper use of statistics, correct?
That's correct, because the figure is looking at long-term averages to try to evaluate impacts to something. Now, long-term averages in that respect would not give you a correct evaluation of whether an impact is occurring or not.
And you state that, you consider it surprising that any differences are shown after all the long-term averaging?
That's correct.
And I believe you compared it, you said if I performed the same type of gross averaging analysis on stream flow data in California, it would indicate that California's history had been devoid of floods or droughts?
It's kind of an artifact of what happens when you start averaging values. When you start looking at averages for values, you start cutting off the high values and you cut off the low values. And when you're looking at, say, for my example, in terms of floods, you want to evaluate what the impacts are from a flood. But if you average all those values, you won't see that impact because there will be no high values. You've trimmed all those high values out. And that kind of differs from how we did our averaging, is that we weren't looking at instantaneous values to try to determine whether or not a value had an impact. We summed those values up over an 82-year period, and we're looking at an aggregate net production of salt in the system rather than looking at just an average value for salt.
Thank you. Also, on page 5 of your testimony, you responded to Mr. Chilmacurry's criticism that we could pull it up if you would like. Exhibit SDWA 328. I'd like to go to page 5 at line 19 to 20. And you respond to Mr. Chilmacurry's criticism that an accurate salt flux analysis requires much more precision than you utilized, correct?
That's what he stated. That's correct.
And I believe you expressed the opinion that any inherent inaccuracy in the data you used in your salt budget analysis is attributable to inaccuracies in the DSM-2 model itself?
That's correct, because we were just using the output from the DSM-2 model. So if there are inaccuracies in the salinity or flow for any of these locations, that same inaccuracy would have carried over to all of the other salinity analyses that have been conducted as part of this project.
Ms. Morris?
I just want to object that that misstates the testimony, because it was more than just looking at the DSM-2. He used chloride conversions, so it's not the exact results.
Plus, hold on.
Yeah.
We are going through and just asking Mr. Burke to affirm what's in his testimony. Is there a specific question you have?
Yeah, so I did want to ask you a little further about the inaccuracies in the model. So, Mr. Burke, wasn't the DSM-2 model developed in the late 1990s?
Outside the scope.
Ms. The DWR and the state water contractors were allowed to explore the inaccuracies in the model, and I wanted to ask him about that.
I didn't even hear that last mumble.
And I wanted to ask Mr. Burke about another source of inaccuracy.
How does that tie into the statement that you first referenced in his testimony on page 5?
That the inaccuracy of the data would be directly attributable to inaccuracies in the DSM-2 model itself.
Okay, so that's a statement.
Mr. Burke, are there other inaccuracies in the model that could contribute to inaccuracies in the model output?
Outside of the scope. He did not go into specific inaccuracies.
I do want to lodge an objection to having substantially more limitations placed on my cross-examination about inaccuracies
Mr. Burke,
in the model.
in your testimony, did you discuss specific inaccuracies in the DSM-2 model itself?
No, I didn't.
It's outside the scope.
And that's a very different ruling than previously. I did want to ask Mr. Burke, did you consider that when you chose data collected at the actual site locations to convert EC to chloride, was this because you considered this the best available data?
That's correct. Whenever you're doing a hydrologic analysis, you always want to try to use actual collected data at the location that you're evaluating whenever possible. You can do different types of modeling analysis to try to simulate the data at these locations, but that introduces another level of complexity and another potential level of error. If you have data collected there, and luckily we did have data collected at these locations, it gives us a much better perspective of what the actual salinities were that were noted at these points.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my questions.
Any redirect, Mr. Ruiz?
No redirect.
Then I thank you, Mr. Burke. As always, I find your work fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
At this time, Mr. Ruiz, do you wish to move your exhibits into the record?
Yes, at this time I'd like to move STWA 328 into the record. Our other exhibits have already been moved in.
Any objections? Not hearing any, we have received it into the record. All right, at this time, I do believe we're at the end of SIR rebuttal for part 2. Let the record note that I just made Mr. Jackson very happy. Are there any matter that staff need to bring up? We will be working on a ruling letter with directions with respect to closing briefs. Let me ask Mr. Mizell, when we last asked you about the projected date for completion of the final environmental document supplemental, you had indicated that it would be in December?
Yes, and that date has not changed as far as I'm aware.
All right. At that point, then we will expect to hear from you. And at that point, we will provide some notice to the parties to obtain their input on potential next steps.
Thank you. And also, I believe I committed previously that should the date change and should we have something earlier, I'll let you know as soon as I'm made aware of it.
All right. Are there any other housekeeping matters?
When would you like cross-examination exhibits submitted?
Thank you. I had forgotten about that. Today is Monday. Please have cross-examination exhibits be submitted to us by noon on Wednesday, and everyone may have until noon on Friday to file any objections. Ms. Desjardins.
Yes, I did ask about submitting a request for correction of the hearing record, and following the hearing officer's direction, I did submit it to the court reporter. There seemed to be some confusion. The last I heard, they had went back to the hearing team, and I just I would like some clarification on what further steps need to be taken to have the court reporters actually view the video, because it does show that I was the one who asked the question and not Mr. Jackson, or who made the motion.
I will turn to one of the staff to respond to that.
One moment, please.
While we get to that, Ms. Meserve.
Thank you. And maybe this is just a clarification. I'm not sure I heard correctly. I guess I just want to make clear for the record that I would oppose any closing briefing prior to the completion of the record, including the final environmental documents for this project. And I'm not sure whether I understood if you had said that you may be
I hadn't said either way, but now that you have made the objection, let's go ahead and hear your arguments, and I can get any additional joinders or any response from petitioners.
I think at this point I don't have a lot of, I think we've already explained that the draft supplemental EIR has some additional pieces to it that weren't in the admin draft, and those haven't been part of these hearings yet. There's at least 2 additional exhibits, as well as the whole executive summary was not included in the admin draft. So we haven't had that document before us. In addition, when a document goes to final, it includes responses to comments and may include other changes to the project. Right now, they've closed the comment period on the CEQA review, and the NEPA review comment period has just opened. And so I could not predict right now, standing here today, any better than anyone, what may occur between now and when the federal and state governments may proceed to final and actually approve these documents and the changes that have been proposed. And so I guess all I can say right now is that I would object to having to produce closing briefs about a project for which there still is not a complete description of, and that may still be subject to even more changes than we have seen in the admin draft supplemental EIR.
Thank you. Any additional input on that particular objection?
Desjardins, California Water Research, and I just wanted to note that to the extent that we saw there was some new information in the supplemental draft EIR, or the public draft EIR, and I think similar to what happened with between the 2015 partially recirculated draft EIR and the final EIR, we're likely to see significant new information. And I would object to the board relying on that new information without our having a chance to respond to it in this hearing.
Now, Ms. Desjardins, that would be a different objection than Ms. Meserve's. So can I just, and in fact, your objection has already been addressed. I think we have said in writing that when that document is submitted, we will ask for input from the parties on how to consider it and whether additional proceedings are necessary. So we'll note your objection, but we're not taking any action on it right now. What I'm asking for input on is Ms. Meserve's objection, which is actually more imminent at the moment, and that is your objection, Ms. Meserve, is with respect to submitting closing briefs prior to that process of accepting the final supplemental and any proceedings as a result of that. Okay, so that's what I'm focusing on at the moment.
Respectfully, Madam Chair, I think it likely that an additional component of the hearing to consider any new information will be
I am not
necessary.
disagreeing with you. I'm just saying we're not there yet.
Well, in that case, it's just that I would consider that filing closing briefs then before the conclusion of the hearing, wouldn't that be premature?
That is exactly Ms. Meserve's objection, which I now understand you are joining. So thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Jackson.
I would just like to add, first of all, I support what Ms. Meserve said.
Thank you for being clear on that.
And I'd like to add that there are lots of other parties who are not here today, which I'm sure would be supporting Ms. Meserve's situation. My question is that I don't mean to start anything new here, but I'm still trying to figure out whether the federal government's in this project or not. And I need their environmental documentation in order to determine that. And writing a brief at this point without knowing what the federal government's documents are going to say and what their position is going to be is just almost impossible.
All right. Let's hear from Mr. Rees before I give petitioners a chance to respond.
It's Dean Reese for the South Delta Water Agency parties. I join in Ms. Meserve's objection and Mr. Jackson's comments. And in relation to that, DWR just came out on September 20th with another economic analysis. And in that, it specifically references a calcium model run, which all 9,000 CFS goes to the SWP. I don't believe that model run is something that has been before us. It's something that DWR is obviously seriously considering. It goes way beyond the discussion on the float approaches before. I asked Mr. Mizell about it over the weekend, and he responded to me this morning that he's looking into it because I've requested the model run. But that goes along with what Mr. Jackson indicated, federal government's involvement or not involvement. That's one issue, but we've got a model run that is, I think, seriously what is where the project is heading, and that's not something that's been vetted before this board, or we haven't seen that model run. It changes things, and I think we need to get an answer on that before we can make any of these final decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. All right, Mr. Mizell, Mr. Offenberg.
Yes, it'd be the department's opinion that we do not need to await the final EIR-EIS in order to establish a briefing schedule for closing briefs. As the hearing officers have indicated, we can assess the final EIR-EIS at that time, and should the changes that are in that document be germane to this hearing, then we can determine if it needs to be briefed and more evidence needs to be produced. There's no indication at this time that changes are going to be made that would bear on the testimony that you've heard over the last several years, and so I don't necessarily think it's necessary to delay the writing of the closing briefs. If I might take a moment to address Mr. Ruiz's question, the economic report that he's referencing has not been submitted as an exhibit in this hearing, and none of the testimony that you've heard from DWR witnesses relies upon the contents of that report. So I guess I would parrot Mr. Ruiz's own objection earlier today about the necessity to produce modeling that isn't relevant to the testimony that's been brought before you. At this point in time, I will be looking into what's behind the economics report, but again, it hasn't been a part of the testimony and exhibits brought before you for support of the department's petition.
Anything to add, Ms. Offenberg?
I haven't thought through this exactly, but I just wanted to point you to there is some precedent for additional environmental work following a closing brief and close of evidence, and that was in the Kachuma hearing, where there was a limited reopener for the purposes of receiving the final environmental document.
And actually, as the hearing officer, I do recall that. Ms. Morris.
I would just note as well, in the Santa Ana River, we had a similar situation, and the EIR came in, it was opened up, but the briefing was done. So my suggestion is that I'm not opposing one way or the other, but that we could do briefing and that there could be an opportunity for a narrower scope of supplemental briefing if necessary based on what we find out. That way we can use our time efficiently. I agree with Mr. Mizell that the testimony is unlikely to change from part 1 and part 2, and so those issues could likely be briefed, and if there were subsequent changes, those narrow issues could be handled in supplemental briefing.
Thank you. Ms. Desjardins.
I did want to point out that the new modeling that Mr. Ruiz just cited is directly contradictory to testimony received by the board in this hearing in rebuttal, and that's the testimony on the float analysis and the supplemental EIR. So we know there is at least one set of information for which one set of testimony on the public draft supplemental that was received here for which new information is available. And so I would object to Mr. Mizell's characterization that no new information is likely to emerge, and in fact, the existence of such evidence has been referred to as of this date, and I would request that the board take this very seriously because a fundamental misrepresentation of the modeling and of the operations in this scenario is not a valid basis per the board's decision. Thank you.
Ms. Meserve, along that line, that topic, or something else?
Not necessarily on the float, but on the larger concept of the efficiency was mentioned a couple of times, and so I wanted to just respond to
So
that
let me
briefly.
ask Mr. Mizell if he wanted to specifically respond to Ms. Desjardins before we move on to Ms. Meserve's.
Yes, please. Thank you. The economics analysis, as I understand.
Your microphone on? I think we've worn out all the microphone in the
Yes.
hearing rooms. And we actually wore out the coastal video equipment. That's why we
projector.
have to be here today.
The economics analysis that Ms. Desjardins is referencing has not changed the department's petition. As we went through this in previous portions of this hearing, whether or not the department is exploring options through either the economics analysis or other decision-making within the department on a single tunnel project, a state water project only project, any number of variations that might be considered in conversations amongst the department staff. It has not changed the basis of this petition. We have not indicated any intent to modify the petitioned project at this time. Where we landed on these sorts of issues before was until the department has officially modified its petition, there hasn't been a decision in front of the hearing officers that would indicate that we're modifying the project. And so I would say that the economics report and the sensitivity analysis referred to by Ms. Desjardins are not clear indicators of anything in terms of the testimony that you've heard. It does not modify any of the petitioner's witnesses or testimony or exhibits at this point in time.
Ms. Meserve.
Thanks. I just wanted to speak briefly to the issue of efficiency since that was brought up by state water contractors. And over the course of the past 3 years, I think despite all our efforts, I think this hearing has been anything but efficient, and that's largely because the petition and the modeling and the project continue to change, and yet protestants have been pushed to continue putting forth evidence and then having that evidence become irrelevant and then having to put in new evidence and then re-explain that and then be cross-examined on why that we relied on old models versus new models. And so it's created a tremendous burden, and it's created a lot of confusion. And I would just urge the hearing officers to really see if we can get the project to settle in and then go to briefing would make the most sense. And even without respect to the issue of the federal participation, which I believe is a big issue, I think it's very important that at this time, the two petitioners have circulated a revised project review, and the discretion rests with those two agencies as to what project they will adopt and what changes they will make and what additional mitigation measures they may adopt in particular or other things like that. And so it's very premature to say we know what those agencies will do, and to have the parties to this proceeding rely on what appears to be, again, a moving target for briefing, I think would just add to the confusion and the complexity of an already really complex record. And so, I mean, and I also want to make sure, like Mr. Jackson pointed out, I mean, there's a lot of us protestants and there's a lot of parties, and any kind of, and I think, you know, the board has always, you know, asked for input on this stuff, and I think this is a perfect example of something that I'd want to make sure everyone had input on, and because there may be other things that I haven't thought of today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Not seeing anything else, we will take all that under consideration. Does staff have a response to Ms. Desjardins regarding correcting the transcript?
Thank you. So not at this time, but at some future date when you'll get some direction from the hearing officers requesting that if there are any corrections at any point during the hearing needed to the transcript, that those be submitted, any alleged errors be identified and proposed corrections submitted, and staff will consider those and work with the the court reporter in considering those. And if there's any follow-up, then that'll occur in due course with the service list being copied, so everyone's aware of the corrections being proposed to the transcript. And then at some point later than that, there'll be a final full set of transcripts.
Thank you, Mr. Derringer. I did submit it back in early September. I did submit for the hearing list. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. It's been quite a journey since, was it July 26, 2016? It's not over yet, but I have appreciated everyone's participating in this effort. I think we've learned a lot. We've, learned what we know. We learned what we don't know, but we've all grown together. And thank you especially for those who are new to our water rights process. I know that it at times can seem extremely, well, I won't use an adjective, but you have all been very patient with all of our proceedings, and you've been responsive, at least for the most part, to our ruling and direction, and for which we are very much appreciated. I am going to go ahead and, assuming my co-hearing officer agrees, cancel the October 4th and 5th hearing date, which is Thursday and Friday of this week. I'm going to reserve October 10th and 11th for now. We do want to discuss what we've heard today as well as some other matters, and we will issue a ruling by the end of the week with respect to what additional next steps are required and whether or not we might want to get together October 10th or 11th for any further discussions. But again, appreciate your participation and your input into this process. Thank you. And with that, we are, what is the official word? Are we recessed, adjourned? Can I say adjourn and let it be over with?
I think adjourn for today works.
All right, adjourn for today. All right. Thank you all. We're adjourned for the day. And special thank you to our court reporters.